the class, you need to unmute yourself. You can do that as well. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for our very first class in this brand new series, a weekly journey into the soul of Torah, starting with the new book of Exodus, the book of Shemot that we are just starting this week. And a couple of just quick announcements before we get right into the material. First of all, many people asked about the textbook. It's optional to have a textbook. There's no charge for this course. It's being generously dedicated in memory of our friend Dick Tucker. However, if you would like a textbook, you can send $25 to the synagogue and we will mail you one. The reason I'm saying it's optional is because we also decided to have the text displayed on the screen during the class. So if you do want a hard book copy, there's a beautiful textbook, which I'm holding up right now on the screen. You can see this will be the source of all the readings that we're going to use. You can send the $25 and we will send you a textbook. Otherwise, you can follow along and view the text as we go along on the screen. Okay. The other part here is, give me 1 second. Okay, we do have a lot of material to cover over the next hour, and therefore I'm going to have to ask you to hold the questions until the end. If you do have a question as we go through, please write it down, and we'll leave a couple minutes at the end for questions. The discussion today is going to be a perspective on the Torah reading based on Hasidic thought, specifically from the works of the Rebbe, and he delves into all 4 categories of Torah perspectives, what's known as Pardes, the orchard, from the Pshat, from the Remez to the Drush to the Sod, all the way from the simple, simplistic, literal meaning to hints and allusions, midrash, as well as some of the mystical elements as well. And you'll see it all come together. Okay, so again, if I can just ask everyone to please mute yourself so there's no background noise, and we will get started right now. Okay, so the title of the class today is there a case for perfectionism? A perfectionist walks into a bar and he says to the bartender, "Why don't you leave? I'll make the drink myself." So, you know, perfectionists, everything has to be exactly right. You have to always score A1, A plus, and to do a perfect job. But sometimes there's a struggle in that. Sometimes there's a lot of pressure. So we're going to get some perspective from this week's story to hopefully help us in that struggle, so that we realize we don't always have to be perfect all the time. It's okay to have some flaws. After all, it's part of being human. But rather, it's about using the God-given gifts and talents that each one of us have to grow spiritually for ourselves and to make the world around us a better place. So let's start with Elijah. Elijah the prophet is perhaps the most popular prophet in Jewish tradition, and he is famous for appearing at many moments of our Jewish calendar. Most famous, obviously, the Passover Seder, where we have a cup of Elijah. We open the door for Elijah. At every bris, there's an appearance of Elijah, right? Some people have the tradition of every Saturday night, they after Havdalah, after we say goodbye to Shabbat, some people have the tradition of singing songs about Elijah. So there's the type of picture that we have of Elijah is a type of prophet who is perfect. He is the closest to perfection that one can get. And the interesting thing that during Elijah's lifetime, he was not this all good, fluffy teddy bear kind of image that a child would have of Elijah the prophet. But Elijah was very harsh on the Jewish people, and specifically when it came to their idolatrous practices, he strongly rebuked his fellow Jews for their pagan followings. And often he was a fearless fighter waging the battles alone. And we read in the book of Kings of a famous confrontation that takes place between Elijah, the one prophet, the one true prophet, and on the opposite side, we have 450 prophets of Baal. Baal was a name of an idolatry famous for the time. And Elijah is demanding from the Jewish people full allegiance. You got to choose if you're on this side or on that side. There's no standing on the fence, being in the middle. Elijah says, I am the lone prophet of God, and he rebukes his people. We're going to look at the text here in the book of Kings, chapter 18. And this is exactly what he says. And Elijah drew near to all the people and said, until when are you hopping between two ideas? They're vacillating between God and the pagan idol. If the Lord is God, go after him. And if the Baal, go after him. And the people did not answer him a word. And Elijah spoke to the people and he says, I have remained a prophet to God by myself. And the prophets of the Baal are 450 men. So here we have a very lonely prophet, right? And after the victory over the prophets of the Baal, there was a Queen Izebel, who wants to have Elijah executed. They're chasing him for his life. And eventually he flees and arrives at a mountain, Mount Chorev, which is actually Mount Sinai. And he has a prophetic vision. And he complains to God about the Jewish people and how sinful they are. He complains about his solitude. He complains about being on the wanted list. And it reaches a point where Elijah even becomes suicidal. He feels, I have no place in this evil world. Have a look at the next text where he reaches out to God, text number 2. And this is what he says. I have been zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They have torn down your altars. They have killed your prophets by the sword. And I have remained alone, and they seek my life to take it. So there are these images that we have of Elijah, where on one hand, there's this absolute commitment to God. And when the Jews around him choose alternative deities to worship, idols, he has no choice, but he does whatever it takes to bring them back to their faith. And even despite his best efforts, he's only marginally successful, which leads him to despair. And then we have the traditional view of Elijah as we view him today, where we have a seat for him at the Seder table, and we have a seat for him at every bris, at every circumcision, so that he can see that the people of Israel are indeed holding on to that covenant. They're holding fast to the tradition, although in his day they were perhaps abandoning their faith, but today they are holding on to it. So Elijah is the kind of personality that is so committed, so absolute in his loyalty to God, that he cannot tolerate any divergence from the straight and true path. He is the model picture of perfection. He was perfect and he demanded perfection from others. And indeed, we are told that in the future era, in the end of days, when Mashiach comes, who will be the one to announce to the world, who will herald the arrival of the Messiah? Once again, it's none other than Elijah the prophet. As Malachi says, "Lo, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of God." So it's only fitting that a perfect prophet will usher in the era where the world will finally reach its state of goodness and perfection that we are working towards. Now, friends, let's contrast this picture of Elijah the prophet with Moses. Moses, on the other hand, has a very, very different imagery when we think about his early life. Yes, he had illustrious ancestry, but from the very beginning, he was an outcast. He grew up as a lone Jew amongst Egyptians in the palace. And then he was forced to escape Egypt to Midian. He was an outcast there, an Egyptian in the land of Midian. He didn't feel at home with the Jews. He didn't feel at home with the Egyptians. Wherever he was an outsider. And one day, Moses is alone in the wilderness, tending to his father-in-law's sheep in Midian. And the story goes, and the Midrash tells us, that a lone sheep escapes. And Moses, the faithful shepherd, chases after the sheep. He cared about every single sheep under his watch. And far off in the Midianite landscape, he's chasing after the sheep, and finally he sees an unbelievable scene. There's a bush that is burning. It's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And so he approaches the bush, the burning bush, and this is the moment where Moses has his very first revelation, where God appears to him and says, "Moses, you're hired. I have a job for you. We're going to take the Jews out of slavery. You're going to lead them out of slavery into the promised land. You are my man." You think Moses happily accepts the job? You think he says, "Sure, Almighty God, whatever you say, I'm at your service"? No. Moses tries to get out of the job. And this is what he says. Moses says the following words: "I beseech you, God, send now your message with whom you would send." These are quite cryptic words, but Moses feels unworthy of being sent to redeem the Jews out of slavery. And so he says to God, send the other guy, send another candidate. And who, in fact, is Moses referring to when he says, send the one whom you would send? Says the Midrash, Moses said to God, send now your message with whom you would send, namely with the person you are planning on sending in the future. In other words, he was talking about Elijah, who will herald the messianic era. He says, God responds, I did not say go and deliver the message to the Jewish people. Rather, go and deliver the message to Pharaoh. As for the person of whom you speak, I indeed plan on sending him in the future to the Jewish people. As the verse we just read from Malachi says, lo, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of God. So in other words, surprise, Moses says, don't send me, send Elijah as the Redeemer instead of me. Now we know that Moses is very humble and feels unworthy of this job of Redeemer, doesn't want the spotlight. But the question is, why does Moses want Elijah? Why does Moses suggest to God that instead of sending me, you should send the one in the future who you plan to send? And when God hears that, he says, that's not the plan. So obviously, Moses felt that Elijah was the best person for the job, and God felt that Moses was the best person for the job. There's obviously a unique quality that Moses possesses, which is why God chooses him for now, and this is why Moses, the man of the hour, when it's time for redemption from slavery in Egypt, Moses is the chosen one. There's obviously something there that we have to learn from. So what does Elijah represent? Perfection. Moses, perhaps imperfection. He wasn't the greatest spokesman. He had a speech impediment. But we have to understand, we have to take a broader picture, a look at Jewish history from the beginning of time till the end of time in order to really appreciate this dialogue, this conversation that's going on at the burning bush between God and Moses. Okay? So, there are many schools of thought, many ancient people that look at time as a cycle. In other words, everything, you've heard the phrase, history repeats itself, right? So any event that happens in history will happen, and we'll get over it, and it'll happen again. And the Jews came along with a new theory. And they said that time is not really something which we measure as a cycle in a cyclical fashion, but rather in a linear fashion. The Jews saw existence as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Torah begins with the word Bereshit, in the beginning. So in other words, there is a direction. We're moving forward in a direction, and we're progressing. So rather than looking at history in a circular fashion where we have the rise and fall of empires, and we have social progress, ebb and flow, we have progress followed by regress, and so many cycles, natural cycles of war and peace, health and disease. We're getting over a period of of a pandemic, hopefully getting to the next stage in our cycle. But history works in a spiral way, so that yes, we're moving forward, but every time we reach a new level, every time we reach a new era in history, we're not just restoring the world to where it was back before, but we have a new point B. We're higher up. So, in other words, when empires fall and rise up again, they're going to be built not on ground zero, but on the roof of the previous empire. So when we look at history in a spiral way, where we're constantly rising, going up, and we might be going in a cycle, but we're constantly reaching higher and higher. This is not just an academic discussion of how to view history, but it has implications for the moral and ethical possibilities. Because if life is just one big circle leading to nowhere, it's just random, there's no meaning, then we're not really getting anywhere. We're not making progress. We're just going back to where we were. And that's not very encouraging. When we see that history and world existence, especially when in the context of Jewish history, as we're discussing today, is a cumulative move towards a better future, and we're constantly going forward, then everything we do has meaning, because it brings us one notch closer to victory, to our destination. Now, Judaism was the very first culture to introduce to the world this view. This idea, in fact, is the mother of all scientific, technological, and ethical progress. Social activism. Not, the world is not going round and round in circles, but in the Jewish idea, there is a beginning, there is a middle, there's an end. We're marching towards a climax, a destination. We're working, the Jewish people introduced the word progress to humanity. So if it's true in a historical sense, it's certainly true in a spiritual sense. From day one, from the very beginning, the world was destined to reach spiritual perfection. And we know that that will climax in the messianic era in the future. But there are landmark events throughout history that have really brought us to new heights. And we're going to discuss some epic events that have radically moved the spiritual needle, bringing the world closer to the finish line. So I want you to look in a broad picture. You have creation in the beginning. The middle high point is revelation, the event at Mount Sinai, when God revealed himself to the entire Jewish nation. And in the future, we have what we call Mashiach, the final redemption. So creation, revelation, and redemption. It seems like somebody needs to mute themselves. Again, if just a reminder, if you can please mute yourself so we don't have the background noise. Okay. Each event, what we're saying, each event in history builds on the previous one. And what we'll see is that after some major events in the past, there was also a major regression. Now, when you look at this narrative of spiritual history as it's recorded in our tradition, it seems, at first glance, it seems like there's a big ping pong happening, big game of ping pong where we're making progress and then regress, progress and regress. We start off with creation. We have perfect human beings, Adam and Eve. God puts them in the Garden of Eden, the most perfect place, paradise. And this was definitely a high point. The way it's described in the Midrash, give me a second. Rabbi Yehuda ben Simon said, the world was created perfect and whole. In other words, when God creates the universe, everything is perfect. But of course, we know it didn't last very long because the serpent comes along and convinces Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. And that stained the world. That left a stain for a long time. All kinds of crazy things happening. The world descends into a state of immorality and corruption. A lot of regress happens. And finally, we have a nation that is enslaved in Egypt and emerges from slavery to stand at the foot of a mountain called Sinai, where they are given a gift, where God reveals himself to them and gives them the tools to bring eternal light to the world. So the task that our ancestors at Sinai were given was a huge one. We are going to get rid of this stain that has lasted since since Adam and Eve ate that fruit, the primordial sin. And now we have a radical holiness, a sanctity that is introduced to the world at Sinai. It was a high point, the revelation at Sinai. And it was an unbelievable moment in history, an epic moment where God reveals his presence to an entire nation. But we know that shortly afterwards, there's another regress. The Jewish people sin by worshiping a golden calf and bring that stain back to the world. Let's have a look at the words of Jewish mysticism from the Zohar. When the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai, they were scrubbed of the snake stain. They were exposed to incredible visions of spiritual light. Their eyes were opened in a way that the stain of the snake could not contaminate them, rendering them immune to history's earlier filth. But when they sinned with the golden calf, all the spiritual light left them, and they were recontaminated with the snake's bite as earlier, bringing death to the entire world. So this was a moment of time. It was a brief moment in history where we cleared the filth, cleared the stain, only to go back to it several weeks later. So what kind of progress is that? What was the whole accomplishment of revelation at Sinai, of Matan Torah, simply to go back to the way things were before? Did the sin of the golden calf bring us back to where we were after the snake's episode with Adam and Eve? That's not very encouraging. It would be kind of disappointing if those 2,500 years did not accomplish anything. we have a very, very important, a fundamental principle in Judaism, and that is that every low brings us to an eventual high. And the high that we reach after the low is higher than where we ever were. So to use the analogy of a diver who presses down, puts pressure on a diving board and lowers the position, not simply to go back to where he was before, but to be able to leap into the air and fling his body up far higher than previously possible. When we're talking about world history, the trajectory of the Jewish people, it's unacceptable to think that any event, such a major event, is just a random circle bringing us back to square one. No, we have the revelation at Sinai changed the world and left its mark even after the sin of the golden calf, even after we fell so low. So creation was a high moment in time. Oops. Creation was a high moment in time. Then it seems as though we keep going backwards. So let's look at the next text, text number 8. The notion that every low leads to an even greater high is well known. It states that the entire purpose of falling off the previous level is for the heights that can be achieved thereby. It follows that the heights reached after the fall are greater even relative to the perch one was at prior to the fall. It follows that the level reached after the giving of the Torah, after Sinai, that in turn came after the sin with the tree of knowledge, is greater even than the perch at which the world stood prior to the sin with the tree of knowledge. The same is true with the height that we will reach with a future redemption, relative to the perch at which the world stood at Sinai at Matan Torah. So what we're saying is that it might look, if you look at Jewish history, it might look like there's a series of back and forth, progress, regress, but it's not just a game of ping pong. We're not just going in circles. There's a spiral staircase and we're climbing higher and higher and higher. Each setback brings us closer to our destination until we reach the ultimate time of Mashiach. So what changed here? What changed between pre-Sinai and post-Sinai? We asked the question, if so soon after Sinai the Jews worshiped the golden calf, then can we really say that something happened at Sinai? Something significant happened? So the difference is in the quality of the relationship between humanity and God. There was one dimension of a relationship that existed pre-Sinai. As a result of Mount Sinai, the world reached a whole new, deeper level. Yes, we took a hit. The relationship took a hit. There was some damage caused as a result of the sin with the golden calf, but it did not change the relationship. The sin of the golden calf, that episode, basically, what that accomplished was it set the stage for an extended period of time where we would work to repair this broken relationship. So yes, there's damage, and the relationship is not perfect. But imagine, to use an analogy, imagine you had this opportunity to have a friendship with a brilliant scholar, a once in a generation mind that decides they want to have a relationship with you. So they reach out to you, and two things happen. First of all, they reveal some of their own personality and charisma to you. So now you have exposure to this person who was only somebody you heard about before. They make themselves vulnerable to you. They open up to you. But there's another thing that happens, and that is simply by virtue of being invited to have such a friendship, such a relationship, you yourself are elevated. You yourself are forced to live in a more meaningful pursuit of life. So at the giving of the Torah, God tells the Jewish people, I want to have a relationship with you. I'm choosing to have a relationship with you. Two things happening here. Number one, God chooses to engage more deeply with us. And at the same time, we become spiritually elevated to be in this relationship. And that is a permanent change. That change that happened as a result of Sinai, we were elevated permanently. So God deeply engages with us. We are lifted to a higher place than we were previously. We get this spiritual boost and increase our spiritual capacity. And even after the sin of the golden calf, that spiritual boost, that potential for a healthy relationship is there. So we're not going backwards. We're not going back to the snake and the stain of that sin. After the intense experience of the revelation at Sinai and the relationship that we forged with God at that moment in time, no sin would ever be able to permanently disrupt that bond, that connection. Yes, we could damage the relationship. It could be in need of repair, but not erase it. Have a look at text 9. Even though the sin of the golden calf recontaminated the Jewish people, it still was not at the same level of contamination as before Sinai, before Matan Torah. This is because the plateau to which the Jews arrived when the contamination was scrubbed at Matan Torah was higher than where the world stood prior to the sin of the tree of knowledge. In other words, the impact of Matan Torah, the impact of Sinai was closer to home with greater saturation. And so even when the Jews thereafter fell, the residual impact was still felt. So what we're saying is that there's a drastic change in the relationship that happens at Sinai. And certainly there will be a drastic change with the relationship in the future era, in the messianic era. The Jewish people have gone through ups and downs. We've definitely fallen. We've sinned. And we've shown that the relationship is not immune to disruption. But the relationship is still there. And the reason, now you can ask the question is, if it was such a powerful moment in time where God reveals himself to us, how did we fall so quickly? How did we regress after such major progress? The answer is the experience of that revelation, as tremendous as it was, as powerful, an intimate moment that we had with God. It was something which literally overwhelmed the world. It didn't transform the world, it overwhelmed the world. And the Midrash describes what took place when the world came to a standstill at Mount Sinai. You know what happened? The Midrash says, when the Holy One gave the Torah, no bird screeched, no fowl flew, no ox mooed, none of the angels flapped a wing, nor did the burning celestial beings chant, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. The sea did not roar, none of the creatures uttered a sound. Throughout the entire world, there was only a deafening silence as the divine voice went forth speaking, I am the Lord your God. In other words, there was a moment in time where the world came to a halt, and the reality that everything at its core is essentially godliness, everything else is a manifestation of that. There was an overwhelming sense of exposure. But it was like shock treatment. It wasn't a transformation that was slow, patient, methodical. It was like this momentary shock. And therefore, after the event, the world basically came back, reverted to seeing itself as a separate existence from God, not as part of the godly reality. That doesn't mean that there was no residual impact, but the world's the world's shocked silence was a temporary experience, and then it leaves a residual impact. Now we have the tools, we have the Torah, which gives us the opportunity to transform the world one mitzvah at a time. In the future era, when we'll finally have reached the climax of this striving for perfection, the prophet Zechariah says that the era of Mashiach will look like this. It shall come to pass on that day, says the Lord of hosts, I will cut off the names of the idols from the earth. They shall no longer be mentioned. And also the prophets and the spirit of evil I will remove from the earth. In other words, there's a lot to look forward to when God removes any confusion of evil and good mixed together as we have now, where we have to kind of sift through, and therefore sometimes we have a hazy picture. When Mashiach comes, we'll have clarity. We'll be able to see the true reality. So what we're saying here, just to summarize, is that there are two ways to view world history. You could look at a cyclical repetition of events that doesn't really lead us anywhere, or a linear chain of events that are accumulating and constantly pushing us forward in a spiral way. And Judaism opts for the latter. Judaism teaches us that there's always the low that follows the high, that's followed by the high, the descent that's followed by the ascent, starting from the beginning of time, moving through history until we reach the climax. And there's a progress, there's a spiritual progress that the world and the Jewish people are moving towards. Creation at the beginning, we then fell by the sin of the tree of knowledge. Back to the high point of Sinai, we fall again at the sin of the golden calf. And now we're at the final point, close to the next high point of redemption. So what we're saying here is that the two events, these two high point events that we are describing as real transformative moments, the revelation at Sinai, which is like the midpoint, and then the future revelation, the future redemption of Mashiach. These two events and these two eras are closely connected. And they are connected through the leaders of Moses and Elijah. In other words, what Moses started at Mount Sinai will climax with Elijah heralding the messianic era. Now, in Hebrew, this is a quick lesson in numerology. Biblical Hebrew has words that are not just arbitrary. Every word is significant. Every word is very rich with meaning. And therefore, each letter that the Torah uses has a specific divine expression and energy, like a spiritual chemistry. And sometimes you take the numerical value of one word, you connect it to a different word, and you see a relationship between the two. So Mashiach is known by many names. But the very first name, the very first hint in which the Torah alludes to Mashiach is the name Shiloh. Have a look at this verse in Genesis. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the student of the law from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him will be a gathering of peoples. Fascinating that the Hebrew word Shiloh, shares the same numerical value as the word Moshe, Moses. If you take it a step further, the word Yavo Shiloh, which means Shiloh comes, Shiloh will come, has the same numerical value as the word Mashiach. So the messianic era is the fulfillment of Moses' life work. The epic event of Sinai primes the world for the eventual state of maturity and perfection that it will reach in the future. So back to our original question. Our original question was, why does Moses want God to choose Elijah? And why does God say, no, my choice is Moses? When God appears at the burning bush to Moses, and he says, Moses, I want you to lead my people to redemption. I want you to take them out of Egypt, take them to the promised land. Moses realizes what's at stake. He's a prophet after all. And he knows that this is a potential of the world reaching its next cosmic step of perfection. We're going to stand at Sinai, and we're going to enter into an intimate relationship with God. Moses suggests, why don't we just fast forward, cut to the chase, go to Mashiach, bring Elijah. Why do we have to go through multiple exiles full of pain and persecution and suffering? I know that Elijah is going to herald the ultimate state of perfection. Let's go straight there. So Moses says to God, you want to bring the world closer to perfection? Let the perfect prophet come and do his thing. I'm not the perfect prophet. I'm imperfect. What does God say? Nice suggestion, Moses. Good idea, but the world is not ready. And therefore, things have to take their course, things have to progress, and there will be a time when we'll be able to eradicate evil and change the world completely. But as long as Pharaoh is still sitting in his palace, there's still evil in the world. We're not yet ready. And therefore, he says, I want you to go. Have a look at text 14. Moses' primary accomplishment was the event at Matan Torah at Sinai. and he thereby empowered future generations to work on transforming the world. In contrast, Mashiach's mission is to complete the transformation and bring about a time when all work will be an environment of a perfect world. So instead of jumping to a state of existence that the world is not ready for, God tells Moses, we're going to stick to a little bit of a slightly less ambitious plan here. And that is, I want you, Moses, to lead the Jewish people in an imperfect world, but I want you to lead them on the path towards perfection. And we will get there. You will give them the tools to repair their relationship, to build, to strengthen this relationship with God. And eventually, we'll be ready for Elijah. Number 14. Moses' primary accomplishment was the events at Matan Torah, at Sinai. And he thereby empowered future generations to work on transforming the world. Mashiach's mission is to complete the transformation and bring about a time when all work will be in an environment of a perfect world. This, then, is the significance of God's response to Moses. I did not say, go and deliver the message to the Jewish people, rather go and deliver the message to Pharaoh. As for the person of whom you speak, I indeed plan on sending him in the future to the Jewish people. Moses was about working in a world that has a Pharaoh, working hard to transform and refine it. By contrast, Elijah and Mashiach are primarily conditioned to operate in a world in which the spirit of evil has been removed from the earth. So when the world is perfect, Elijah is the right one to bring that era and operate in that type of environment. And this is coming back to the very beginning where we discussed the problem with trying to be perfect, the perfectionist within each of us. How can a person be happy knowing that they're not perfect? The inspiration for this, my friends, is from Moses. Look at his own life. He wanted to jump straight to the perfection of Elijah, and he feels that he's unfit and unworthy for the job because of his imperfection. And God says to him, you are precisely the person we need because we're working in an imperfect world. Perfection will come. That's for the future. For now, we're living in a broken world. It's far from perfect. We have work to do. We have to make progress. And the good news is that the progress that we're making is cumulative. So we're not just regressing to back where things were before. We're striving towards a perfect world. We're working towards the time of redemption when the world at large will reach its climax. We can be part of that journey. For now, the way to work to be part of that journey, to bring that time closer, is to work within the confines and limitations of an imperfect world. After all, we are imperfect, flawed human beings. And therefore, our job is to deal with the circumstances and the environment that we have We have the tools. The Torah guides us, gives us the mitzvot, the opportunities for connection that we have to make the world a better, more perfect world. And so if we ever feel that it's a lonely job, if we ever feel that it's hard to be a perfectionist, we should realize that Elijah, the perfectionist, was also very frustrated because he was dealing with imperfect people. But there are situations where perfection is, is good, is valuable, such as the messianic era. The world will be ready for perfection then. But in the meantime, when does Elijah come to visit us? At specific times, like the Seder or the Bris, where Elijah, the perfectionist, learns to appreciate that while we may not be perfect as people, we are holding true to our covenant with God, and we are continuously working towards bringing a better tomorrow. Moses is the perfect leader to teach us that message, to transmit that message, to get the Torah from God, and to teach it to us, to help us work towards bringing the world to its final perfection. So the link between Moshe and Mashiach is in the numbers, as we saw earlier with the numerology. Moses requests Elijah's perfection to just complete the job. The world was not ready just yet. And therefore, Moses was the one chosen by God. Until the time of Mashiach, we have the Torah and the mitzvot, which will help us bring clarity and perfection and goodness and kindness to a broken and imperfect world. Let us all do our part. Each of us has opportunities to utilize the resources and the gifts that God has given us as individuals to bring the world to that state of perfection. And we will see that incremental progress until the day when we'll see the climax and we'll be able to experience the true and ultimate redemption. Thank you for joining us. This is the end of the formal presentation. If anybody needs to go, have a wonderful week. I am going to stay around for any questions that you'd like to bring up. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Until then, I wish you a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Go, please talk.
I want to, perhaps a silly question, but I actually remember the excitement as a child every Pesach at the Seder when we would leave the wine for Elijah. And so I was wondering how will we recognize Elijah when he comes in physical form?
It'll be all over social media and the news.
Well, thank goodness.
And all the newspapers will print the exact same story.
Yeah, it won't be hard. It won't be hard to recognize when you'll hear about it. Don't worry.
I have a different question. This is about, of course, perfection and imperfection. But in today's world, how do you choose among two imperfections? In other words,
You're talking politics.
What goes on in the world, I'm trying not to make it that way. Let's move away from it. But the point is, we do live in this imperfect world, and that's easily to be accepted. And of course, as you just said, when Elijah comes, everything is perfect. I get that. But how about making the choice within an imperfect world when you, of course, possess imperfect and incomplete knowledge?
This is, Stu, what you are articulating is our daily challenge. we are all living in an imperfect world, and our job is to take that truth that we know from the Torah and shed the light of the Torah into which is obviously divine wisdom. Obviously, it's the Torah is perfect because it's an expression of God's wisdom.
Correct.
And if we can implement some of that truth into our imperfect world, then we have done our part to bring progress to creation. In other words, each one of us has a corner of the world that we are given to perfect. It may be our immediate circle of influence, whether friends, family, coworkers, and if we live ethical, moral lives enlightened by the Torah's teachings, then we are actually perfecting our environment, our world. So don't worry about the big picture. Don't worry about bringing peace to the Middle East. We'll leave that for others. Worry about your own world and how you could bring more perfection to your immediate circle of influence, and you will see how you make a real difference.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I recall being taught, and maybe this is a difference in philosophy, that Mashiach would come and you talked about us perfecting and improving and the spiral and all that. But I had also seemed to recall saying that there was the Mashiach would come when things were very good, but also perhaps when things were very bad. So I'm kind of trying to reconcile that in my mind.
So that's really a whole nother class, but I'll give you the brief version. The brief version is that either one is a possibility. In other words, if we look at the goodness as cumulative, right, and all of the positive things that humanity and the Jewish people have brought in terms of making progress to the world, if each generation is building on the previous generation's accomplishments, the analogy given is that we are a midget standing on the shoulders of giants, and the midget can see even further than the giant, right? So we're building upon the past accomplishments, so we can reach a tipping point where the world has accomplished the good that it needs to accomplish in order to transition to that world of perfection. That's one scenario. Another scenario is that, things can, like you said, things can get so bad that there's no choice, that God has to save us and pull us out of the schmutz, or the dirt, and bring a savior. But I prefer the first one, where we are working towards making a better world, and in many areas, you could, if you think about it, the world today is a better world. There's more kindness being practiced today than before. We live in a time where there's tremendous opportunities for practicing goodness and kindness on an individual level, on a community level, on a national level, on a global level, and as we reach that necessary level, that cumulative good that we have accomplished collectively, we'll reach that tipping point, and it'll be time for Elijah to herald the coming of Mashiach.
Rabbi Goldman,
Yes, David.
this is about the Pasha Shemos. Now, the law by the Egyptians was to kill the firstborn, and that's why Chabad put Moses in a basket. But Aaron was the older brother. So how is it wasn't done, that for Aaron, that he had to be hidden or put in water or being taken away from his home, like Moses, because Moses was the younger brother and Aaron was older.
Aaron was 3 years older, and the Egyptian decree happened when Moses was before Moses was born. So the decree didn't happen when Moses was an infant. It happened when Moses was an infant. That's why the story of the basket happens with Moses.
Okay.
Rabbi
I'm just
Goldman,
curious.
Yes, Linda.
I just have to say something. I understand now why everything that's going on in our society hurts so deeply, because the moral compass of life, it's we're spiraling down only to get higher, but it's tough. It's tough to see this go on. It's hard to live through it too. It's not easy. You said that morally, ethically, that's so important to people. I don't know if people realize it anymore. And my sister and I are having trouble with that. We are.
It's no
it's
question about it.
It's tough.
It's a very tough and challenging journey
Yes,
to
it
get
is.
there. To get there. So, knowing that we're part of the bigger picture, this journey is part of a bigger picture, is a very empowering type of thought to help us, build the strength, the inner strength that we need to overcome these tremendous challenges that we're experiencing.
I know.
But it's definitely not an easy journey.
No,
by
it's
no
not.
means. There's and that's essentially that's what Moses was trying to prevent when he says to God, why do we have to go through all this and make me, the temporary redeemer? Why don't we go to the permanent redeemer right now, and we'll skip all the pain and suffering of thousands of years of exile? And for some unknown reason, God felt that the world was not yet ready, and that we have to work harder to bring about the healing that we need collectively in order to be ready for that time of perfection and peace and redemption that we're all praying for.
Amen. Thank you.
Okay, so again, it's been a real pleasure to study together with all of you. Thank you for joining us, and I wish you a wonderful, productive, meaningful, safe, and healthy week. And when I say healthy, I mean both physically healthy and spiritually healthy. So we will, God willing, continue this conversation next week, same time, same place, unless Elijah comes and surprises us. Then maybe we'll
And I
be,
will read that on social media.
yeah, and then we'll be able to study with the greatest teachers in person in Jerusalem. That would be
Bezat
nice.
Hashem. Shabbat shalom, Hakol.
All the best. Take care.
All right,
Thank
bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And if Elijah comes, I'd rather dance.
We can dance too.
Amen.
All right, Rabbi. Bye.
Don't worry, we'll dance. We'll dance plenty.
Bye.